I'm Adrian Sandoval,
And I'm Lamont Williams.
and we are playing Dread. And this month, we are talking about Until Dawn, a game that actually fairly recently came back into the public consciousness because it's got a remaster that's coming out soon and was just got its first trailer at the last Sony State of Play. So we're probably going to talk a little bit about that today as well. But to kick us off, I'm just kind of curious to hear from you, Lamont. Do you remember the first time that you heard about this game? Probably the most recent game that we've covered.
So the thing is that I don't. Somehow this game just completely went over my head. Like I don't know how I missed it because it's the kind of game that I feel like was made for me. But no, I truly do not remember this game even coming out. But I know they came out in 2015, so I don't remember even what I was doing in 2015.
I think something that is going to be a common occurrence in this podcast, and I'm saying this mostly for me, but this might be true for you too, is that whenever we cover something that is more recent, and I'm using recent in heavy quotes here because 2015 was almost 10 years ago, the less likely I'm going to remember like first hearing about it. Because by this point, I have already shipped a couple of games. I am very well versed into the game industry, and like games just sort of wash over me at a certain point, right? They were not like events quite in the same way, or at the very least, I didn't just discover them. Like, I mean, honestly, it's a pretty good guess on my part that the first time I heard about this game was when it was announced at E3 slash Gamescom slash whatever press event that I was watching. It's not like I just discovered it in a gaming magazine or saw it at a friend's house or something like that.
Honestly, no, that makes sense. I was trying to like do some time travel. I'm like, all right, 2015. I'm like, well, Grayson was 3. Um, I was gaming. I just maybe I was doing more PC gaming at the time.
So I think an important bit of context before we kind of like jump into the specific dev history is just kind of know that this game wasn't a PlayStation 4 launch title, but it is one of the first games I would argue that was kind of a showcase for the PlayStation 4 and its tech and its technology. That was kind of like one of the big focuses of this game, and it kind of does start to kind of like point into the history a little bit, but people still have a hard time thinking of the PlayStation 4 as an older console. Although, again, yeah, 2015 is almost 10 years ago, and we're fairly well into the PlayStation 5 life cycle. I mean, that's something I actually hear quite a bit about the remaster that I mentioned we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth later on. Is that a lot of people ask, like, what was the point of remastering this game? It's still a fairly new game, but again, at the same time, 10 years ago.
Yeah, we'll talk about it a little more, but the big thing is that like we have to talk about how it was a PlayStation 4 game, but it didn't start that way.
I think that is a good point to kind of segue into talking a little bit about where this game actually came from. The interesting thing is that Supermassive Games, although this was their debut game, was made up of developers from Psygnosis. Psygnosis is a British developer. They date back to the early 90s, publishing Lemmings from DMA Designs, later Rockstar Games. But from there, Sony would essentially be their like go-to developer in the PlayStation days. Probably Wipeout was like their big premiere title. So although Psygnosis has been around for a while, they didn't really become a household name until working with the Sony PlayStation. So it's not a surprise to me that Supermassive would be so tied to PlayStation and the PlayStation brand.
Now, Adrian, I want to back up really quick because talking about Psygnosis, kind of looking back at them, two things. Their logo has always stuck in my head. I don't know what it was about that owl, but, like, it's burned into my memory, and also, I have to say that one of the other games that they published, for the PlayStation, something near and dear to my heart, they published The City of Lost Children,
Ooh.
like the
Mhm.
game, and that is somewhere that lives in my soul. So, I just needed to, like, talk about that real quick.
Yeah, never played the game. I mean, I played a little tiny bit of it, but, I'm much more familiar with the movie. Yeah, no, like and, like, I agree in terms of the logo especially because, that's how I always think of Psygnosis. Whenever anyone says the name, that's the first thing that pops up in my head. I don't even really think about the games. I mean, like, looking at the list, I've played G-Police, I've played Colony Wars, but I've played them, like, for, like, 2 minutes apiece, right? Like, these are not games that, like, stick with me. And, you know, they're not really games that would have told me that this developer would go on to make something like Until Dawn.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, one of the games that I did beat that's on that list is, A Bug's Life game,
Of all things.
of all things. But hey, there's movies involved with that. That's movie tie-in. We're getting there.
What's interesting to me about this game, which is an adventure game, we're going to talk more about the kind of adventure game it is a little bit later on if you're not familiar with it, but for now we'll just go with an adventure game. Um and ultimately it would be a tech demo for the PlayStation 4 with like amazing facial capture animation, but originally was supposed to be a showcase for the PlayStation Move. I mean, I feel like you do see elements of it in the game. Like there are occasionally moments where they bring in motion controls, parts where your character has to stand still or not breathe, in which case you're just supposed to be very, very steady with the PlayStation 4 controller, and keep it from like going outside the lines, which I always hated. But we'll talk more about that when we dive into the game itself. Like the elements are there from its original PlayStation Move version, but I do feel like the final game um probably removed a lot of those elements as well. It's not like a big focus. It's pretty much just like one or two mini games that you encounter. So I think it's safe to say that the final game that we got is actually very, very different from that original conceit. Maybe some more of those elements were used in the VR spin-off titles, Rush of Blood and Inpatient would be my guess.
Kinda to go into that PlayStation Move again, I was reading kind of a little bit more about that, and a lot of those elements were definitely taken out, because when it was a Move title, it was first person view. You were using the Move controllers as a flashlight. So that was a lot of your interaction was just having a light and using that to uncover clues, and it didn't sound like it was a very fun game. It sounded like it was an interesting project, but not very fun. Honestly, the biggest thing that, like, changed their mind really came down to, the debug camera. Like, that's the thing that I was reading is that they when they entered the debug camera, it changed it from first person to third person, and that third person view, they felt like they could do so much more with it being a third person versus the first person with the move controls. So, like, it kind of got, an overhaul in gameplay.
Which is so funny because most of the game you're not even controlling characters, you're watching characters. So, um, that again is just one of the more interesting things that like this game, for those who have never played it before, you might be more familiar with the Telltale adventure games, which are sort of well, I think that honestly kind of jumps into one of the topics I wanted to ask you about, Mont, is we talked about this off podcast, but I'm going to ask you again for the recording. Like, what would you actually call this genre of game?
So, I had a couple of thoughts on it. My initial thought is that this is the evolution of, like, the choose your own adventure book. That was, like, the first thing that came to mind when I started these games. I was like, "Oh, this is choose your own adventure, and I loved like the Goosebumps uh was like the Give Yourself Goosebumps series. Like Night in Screaming Armor was something that I still think about to this day. And so if I could call it a, was that graphic choose your own adventure game, I would probably call it that. But I do know that like kind of from looking it up, it has a name for what they're calling it. I just I want to see. How about you, Adrian? What would your thoughts be? Like, what would you name this genre?
Well, real quick, because I have a lot to say about this genre. I want to go back to what you said. Like you said that they have a name for it. When you say they, do you mean supermassive or do you just mean culture at large?
Culture at large.
Okay, because I was gonna say, like, I feel like developers give names to these things all the time. Like Shenmue, they called like free, full reactive eyes entertainment or something like that. And it's like, Shenmue is a cool adventure game. It's an adventure game. It's a graphic adventure game. A little different. It's not point and click, but it's an adventure game, right? So I just wanted to be sure, first of
Yeah.
all. I mean, I think the name that I got written down here that I've been going with is cinematic choose your own adventure game with an emphasis on adventure because you mentioned like graphic adventure, which for people of a certain age, which you and me definitely are, the 30 to 40-year olds out there, we have come to know adventure games or this style of adventure game that are more narrative or story focused as just adventure games. Sometimes they're called graphic adventure games as opposed to text adventure games. And graphic adventure kind of came up as an opposite term for ones when they did start to have pictures. Usually they were still pictures, they weren't animated originally. And it just kind of evolved from there. I mean, most of them didn't even really have a character on screen that you controlled. Originally, they were just like first person slideshows. You were looking at something from a first person perspective or from the view of a camera, but not necessarily like from you didn't see your character, you didn't have like a control to like move anybody.
Yeah, I definitely remember that.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And then eventually you had characters that you could move around and click around with the mouse, and that's where you get point and click adventure games from. So, and this is like a real quick bit of game history here is that, Telltale was ex LucasArts devs. And LucasArts, despite being the Star Wars studio, making PC games for a long time, they were mostly well known for making point and click graphic adventure games where you have items that you are collecting in the level. You need to use those items to solve puzzles, but they were linear games. There were different actions that you could take that might slightly modify some things, and they might have like certain small branches that change the ending in some way. But for the most part, they were very, very linear games. It wasn't like the promise of a choose your own adventure book where there are all kinds of different branches and all kinds of different endings, because games are fairly limited and like to do like a real true branching narrative takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of graphics, takes a lot of sound, and that only has become even more expensive now for the kind of game that Until Dawn is. So Telltale comes around at a time when that genre was dead. Nobody was making graphic adventure games anymore. Like because everything moved to 3D, making that kind of game would have been number one, really, really expensive, but number two, they just weren't selling the way that they used to. So like many people thought that genre was dead. Then Telltale like gets its start really making more streamlined point and click adventure games like your Sam and Max season one. I think a lot of people forget that game had inventory object puzzles. It didn't really have a lot of branching story moments. You didn't really select what you were going to say. Like Telltale, like would experiment with that more and more each game, but it was really The Walking Dead season one, a game that I'm sure we're gonna cover sometime in the future, where they basically just completely ditch inventory object puzzles and just go on to this idea of like, no, it's about your choices, the things that you say to characters, the things that you do, and what makes certain people happy and pisses other people off, and how they react to those things. That's what's really going to change the story with this sort of, I would argue, overinflated promise that like everyone's going to have a different story, everyone's going to have a different adventure. So yeah, like to your point, Lamont, you mentioned that it's like, this really does remind you of the choose your own adventure books and is essentially what Telltale games became. Like, we took a very long and windy road from these fairly linear, but still very immersive adventure style games that were more focused on problem solving and puzzles to get to a more, I mean, for lack of a better word, passive experience, I guess. This is a long-winded way of me saying I agree with you. I would just like throw in the word cinematic because I feel like that is more apt to this style of game. It's just it is a playable movie is more indicative of the engagement of the game as opposed to like again graphic adventure, which is an adventure game where there are graphics, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense to me. Before we leave this subject, my other note here is like what I see the game being described as is an interactive drama horror game.
Interactive drama horror game. I mean, that doesn't really tell me what the game is, right? I mean, genre is a fickle semantics thing, right? Um, but all games are interactive. I mean, I would also use those words to describe Silent Hill.
Honestly, yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Like you
Mhm.
are interacting with the game, you are controlling the character, you are making the decisions. It is certainly there is drama and horror going on. Yeah, no, those are all it's about right.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, I feel like, adventure games, that's also a very broad category. That could be a point and click adventure game, I mean, like the LucasArts games we were talking about, or it could be The Legend of Zelda. Whereas this definitely has like this again focus on choosing what you say and how that affects people. The issues that I typically have with the way that we talk about these kind of games, and I promise you that this does have like a point related to Until Dawn. So going back to like that promise that I feel like Telltale made with The Walking Dead season 1, that everybody who plays these games is going to have a very different experience, that the story can branch out in all these wild ways. Like I mean like these kind of games tend to be what a lot of people see as the promise of video games, that the interactivity is the most important thing. It's player agency, it's player choice. We can have an infinitely branching story. Like you are immersed in this world, you are the one making choices. Anything can happen. I personally feel like that is a very boring approach to making a story. Number one, like I think that might have appealed to me like at a younger age. The older that I have gotten and the more that I have thought about writing and stories and the things that like really engages me in games, I don't find the idea of like having like the infinite branching story to be that exciting. I mean, number one, like for it to like really truly have that, number one, you would just have to like have like the possibility of not engaging with something and just having the most boring thing in the world, right? It's not really a story at a certain point when I decide to just like, I don't care that the world is ending. I'm just doing my dishes and living my life, man. Like that has to be a part of it, right? If you're going to have like unlimited interactivity, right? First of all. Second of all, like in this current era, there's no way to really actually do that, and it was definitely not possible when Walking Dead came out in, like, what was that, 2012? Certainly not possible with Until Dawn in 2015. Like, of course, there's going to be, like, a finite amount of branches. Of course, things are going to do that because, the complaint people have with Walking Dead, you play it a second time, it's actually not radically different from the first time that you play it. Like, there are certain story beats that have to happen and will still take place regardless of if one character died and one character stayed alive.
This character will remember your decision.
I don't know if you've heard this before, Lamont, but like the Telltale games say that, right? Like you make a decision, it says X so and so will remember this. And sometimes that is true, and sometimes they do throw things in your face. Most of the time when you see that message in a Telltale game, like it's a lie.
I remember that.
Like the game doesn't like keep track of literally every single thing that you do and say. Because video games are a magic trick. They're an illusion. just like movies are an illusion or any kind of like entertainment media that deals with the fictional story, like there is like some magic in there to, sleight of hand to get you feeling like someone's going to remember that. And just even putting those simple words, like Telltale has said, like puts people like into this like position where they feel like that's what's happening. And then like for a lot of people who again play it a second time, like it's easier to see through the trick the second time you watch it. Like to me, that's not what actually makes The Walking Dead season 1 fun. Like, and that doesn't what isn't what makes it a good story. It's more about that destination at the end of the current journey that you are on. It doesn't matter to me that like no, it is inevitable that this character will die. And I feel like a lot of these style of games like play into that inevitability, like they make it like a big theme of the story. But the promise of these games is that you're going to have something radically different. And I feel like if that's what you're expecting, you're going to be so disappointed in 90% of the cases.
Part of as you were saying this, one of the things that came to mind was thinking about the, Alone in the Dark episode we did, and how they set up that trap in the very beginning where you fall through the floor, and how, like, that one thing, just putting that one little seed in the game has you always thinking that it's possible. And that's what Telltale did with, saying that, this character is gonna remember that decision, is that, even if they don't remember that decision, that seed is planted. So you're always gonna be thinking, "Well, they might remember this."
Yeah, for sure. And it is a shame to me that rather than kind of being, like if you do see the magic trick, you do see through it to kind of like see that and kind of admire the craftsmanship. Whereas rather it feels like the reaction for a lot of people is to be disappointed. Is to be disappointed that no, this game actually isn't radically different every single time that I play. And again, I feel like I could dive a lot deeper into that if we were talking more about Walking Dead. Maybe we will when we do eventually do that episode. But what I will say at this stage, Until Dawn is probably the well, not just Until Dawn, but all of the supermassive horror games, such as the Dark Pictures anthologies and the Quarry, etc., etc. But starting with Until Dawn, I feel that this is the closest any studio has really come to that promise for this style of game.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree.
And honestly, it's about as close as we can get, unless we're talking about just turning everything into auto-generated, machine learning slop. But to kinda get back to what I was saying before about, like, that promise of, like, the infinite game or the infinite story, that's not happening until we can actually give, like, a artificial intelligence a soul, and that is not what this current version of AI is. Like, the current version is we have an NPC that is, like, powered by AI and you are talking to it. You're never going to get, like, a really good, like, authored story from that character because it's not really a personality, it's a whole bunch of autocorrect. I think there are gonna be interesting things that games can do with that, but you're not gonna get the infinite story just yet, and I don't know that we ever will. I am very impressed with what Until Dawn and other supermassive games have done in order to, like, really sell this idea that these different variations are different, and, so I think, like, at this stage, probably an important thing to do is just kinda dive in a little bit into how this magic trick actually works. Clarify something from the previous segment really quickly. I should point out that one of the things that Telltale started doing with their future games is that when they started making other seasons of their games, the choices that you make in season 1, season 2, season 3, etc., all do start to pile up. And by the time that you get to say like the season 4 of Walking Dead had a subtitle, but I don't remember. I didn't actually make it that far in that series, honestly. But even like BioWare's Mass Effect series does a similar thing. By the time you get to like the third or fourth sequel of it all remembering your choices, you do get something that's kind of radically different. But like each player's different destination requires all of these different games. You get a similar effect in all of Supermassive Games through this sort of branching system And the way that they do it is pretty clever. Rather than, like, say, a Telltale game where there's typically only one character that you're following. What Until Dawn does, which I think is really clever, is that each character, outside of just the choices that they get to make, have a set of personality traits that at the beginning of the game have a default value. And one character can be more stubborn, one character can be more honest, they can be more immature, etc., etc., etc. And the choices you make as a particular character will increase or decrease these statistics as you go. But you're still the one making the choice, and you can like make a choice that's against their character trait, let's say, right? They don't necessarily lock you down a certain path, depending on the choices that you make. But what they do, they have a whole cast of characters that you are constantly swapping between. So you might play one character for 5 minutes and then play another character for another 5 minutes. And when you are not playing one of the other characters, they also have a series of choices that they are given that they can make, but you're not in control of those choices anymore. Those choices are dictated based off of their stats. So the choices you make as one character will still like have a ripple effect down the road, but that ripple effect isn't something that you are necessarily in control of. And I haven't like done a deep dive into the code or anything. I don't believe there's any like randomness to it either. So you can set yourself down a path. You're just not 100% sure which path you're setting yourself down at when you're making decisions as a character early on in the game. At the like what that means at the end of this is that number one, you can't be 100% sure that like every single choice that you make is going to lead you down the exact same path every single time because you're not in control of every single decision that's being made, which I think is just a really, really interesting way to handle it. And all of the games, starting with Until Dawn, actually do give you a sort of chart that kind of shows you where the big branching story moments are. And when something happens that is going to like radically alter, they do like a really cool effect. In this one, they have like a butterfly effect theme, and so like there's a big like little butterfly explosion when you do something that has going to have like radical ramifications down the road. But they actually do track all of these. Not only do you have these really big moments that really can like seriously alter the story, you actually get to see what they are. So I almost find like like a refreshing honesty that's not there with the Telltale ones, where rather than like kind of promise something, but then like kind of like keep it in like completely in shadows for you to get disappointed. Like you can actually like kind of go back through this like book and basically be like, oh wow, okay, that's where something big happened. I wonder what would happen if I changed it here. They kind of let you know that like at not up front, but at the end of it, and like really plays into like why you wanna play through these games. So Lamont, this was your first time playing through Until Dawn. We played it through it together. This is like my second or third time. Like, how did this like work for you? Like, because I know you've played other adventure games of this style, like this kind of choose your own adventure style. Like, how did Until Dawn like feel compared to like others in this genre you've played?
So, I have to think about that a moment because, like, I've played a lot of adventure games. I played through the Telltale games. I played through quite a few like this style, but nothing quite like Until Dawn. I know we're going to talk about it later, but one of the big things that I thought was funny was when they were doing the writing for this game. They said that their aim was to make the game equivalent of a slasher film. And I A, feel that. B, and this is a game I wanna talk about sometime later, I'm wondering if they've ever played the game Obscure because, their aim was already done, but they did it in a way that I thought was so cool. Starting off, like, just playing the different characters, and I didn't realize, like, out the gate that the decisions that I was making was changing the characters' personalities a little, maybe even a lot more than I realized, but that was really cool out the gate. I love the teen slashers. I love them. I remember, taking a bunch of friends out for my birthday to go see I Know What You Did Last Summer. So that's something that was really exciting to me was playing a game that was a teen slasher that I got to make these choices. And, so I really there's a lot that I enjoyed. I liked the characters. I liked to hate some of the characters. We talked about that a bit. There was a couple of characters that I really was just like, "Please, please let me just this character has to die." Um, and then somehow, some way I kept them alive.
There's no real goal, I guess, in these games, but if there was a goal of any supermassive horror game, the goal really is to, like, see how many characters you can keep alive till the end. It's possible to keep everybody alive, and that's generally what I'm shooting for when I play one of these games, is to try and keep everyone alive. I don't know that I've ever actually done it, but you're right, no, there are definitely characters in this cast, like any good teen horror thriller, where you want them to die, and I think that's actually an interesting thing if we're talking about video games as the story that I control. I'm in control because I'm the one living it. The problem is that that's not how stories work. Like, stories work through, building and creating tension and drama. And particularly in, like, the kind of horror movie that we're talking about, typically, there are characters that are meant for you to want to die. It is supposed to be fun to watch those characters get killed off in your typical teen slasher, and, like, how do you build to that, and how do you create that sense when, again, like, it's a video game, you're also trying to make it so that my choices matter. Like, how do you create those characters that you wanna see die? And I think Until Dawn actually does do a really good thing in a lot of Supermassive games is that it's like, well, if I wanna see them die, I could totally make it my goal, right? Like what you're saying. Yes, teen horror slasher is what they're going for, but there is a twist to it. 18s in a cabin. Snow is everywhere. So that means that being able to move from place to place is tough, which adds to the tension and everything. One of the things that the writers talked about, and I'm curious to get your opinion on this, Lamont, is they wanted to have like stock characters, like the kind of characters you always see in a horror movie, but then put a twist to them. They wanted them to have a little bit more depth or have a little bit more to them. When you start playing the game is that you recognize them. Okay, Matt's the jock. Chris is the funny guy. But the more that you play the game and the more that like you see them react to things, you realize that they have a little bit more depth to them, that they are kind of a twist on the standard stereotype. That was the idea. That was the goal for these characters. Do you think they accomplished that goal?
Oh, so it's funny because I don't think they accomplished that goal. Other people may. I didn't catch that during my playthrough. I didn't really see like those archetypes, which is funny because maybe I pulled an opposite of Cabin in the Woods, where like by the end of Cabin in the Woods, we learned that that there were these archetypes. Like I feel like if they started as these genre characters, and then they evolved, I think I did the opposite. I think I made them into the genre characters by the end because my decisions definitely like put them in holes.
Yeah. I mean, I've played through this game several times at this stage, and no offense to the writers who I found out researching this episode have a little bit more of a storied history behind them, and they were specifically chosen for this game because they've written other horror movies and such. That's Fessenden and Graham Resnick, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. No offense to them at all, but like I always thought the dialogue in this game was fairly weak. I still think it's probably one of the weaker entries of all the Supermassive games that I have played. Yeah, like that didn't really come through for me either. I mean, like I feel like that the appeal to this game and what makes it work, it like that's not a huge disappointment or anything. I wasn't really expecting the teen horror slasher to have like amazing dialogue, though I will say like when I first played this game, I didn't know that Supermassive was Exognosis. I didn't know that they were British in origin. I honestly thought this was a case of a game from like say France or Poland, somewhere where English isn't necessarily the first language, or at least like the typical writing that you would see in like an American movie. Like another good example of this is like Heavy Rain, where the game takes place in Philadelphia, but it was totally written by French game developers, and you know, if you live in America, you feel that difference. That was always the kind of vibe that I got from Until Dawn, but no, it was written by two American filmmakers.
Yeah, and it's funny because they definitely there were some lines in there that made me think they're very European, I feel like someone mentioned going on holiday or something, and I was just like, Okay, we don't use that in the States, not like that, so this has to have come from somewhere else."
It's totally possible that Larry Fessenden and Graham Resnick, who are I found out like were very heavy in the marketing in this game. They appear in the in-game documentaries that you can unlock. So they really want you to know they got these writers on here. I would not be surprised if they did the treatment for the game and that the actual dialogue was written by the developers themselves, or like the structure of it was written by the developers.
Yeah, no, I think that tracks.
hmm And I want to be clear, like this game has a pretty decent cast. I mean, definitely some of the bigger names in this list were well, Robbie Malik is probably the biggest name currently, but I think that, you know, at the time in 2015, he was not the biggest name. The biggest name certainly is Hayden Pantiere, but the cast all does actually a really good job with the awkward dialogue. Ultimately, they definitely sell the characters they're supposed to be. And in particular, we really need to shout out Rami Malek, who is going to explode off of not because of this game, but certainly, but Mr. Robot comes out basically around the same time that this does. And I think everybody in the cast does a good job, whether or not they go on to do bigger things. But Rami Malek is acting circles around everybody in this game as Josh, the game's initial fake out villain, kind of like at the beginning of the game, coming off as if he's like acting like somewhat like a normal character who's just happy to see his friends, but you can always tell there's just like something like slightly not right there.
He is hanging out with all of these friends on the anniversary of the death of both of his sisters. So I feel like that's kind of where it is too, where it's like, hey, we haven't seen each other since this tragedy, but I kind of want everybody around, but also like, you know, there's that weird thing where it's like, well, okay, it's a little weird that you want everybody around, but at the same time, I guess like that feeling that you're getting from it is that like there's some hurt underneath of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, if to go back to what we were saying before about like the characters, like kind of like playing into these stock roles, I think Josh. I mean, Rami Malek ends up being the character who I feel like gets the most to work with, right? Like he's got the most in depth backstory. He's got a good reason for being motivated the way that he does, and that's something that like if we're going by the I know what you did last summer model, like most of the time the killer is the person who died, so you don't really get their backstory. You don't really get that much, and even stuff like I don't know if you've ever seen the original Prom Night.
No, I haven't.
Spoiler alert for like like 40-year-old movie. You know, the big twist there is that the whole time they make it seem like it's a supernatural thing where it's the girl who accidentally died on prom night, but at the end of the movie it's revealed that it's her brother,
Okay.
right? It's that kind of like Scooby-Doo kind of thing. And in that movie, like for the most part, the brother character is just there and there's like kind of like no hint at it. Until Dawn, Josh has really good motivation. And if anything, like the twist that like Josh isn't like he's messing with people but not killing people. I mean, that's fairly unique, honestly, in that like there's something off about him, which, in any good murder mystery, it's never the most obvious person. Here, Josh, like, actually is doing something, he's just not the killer.
Oh, yeah. I definitely would say, to anyone listening to this, play the game. I don't wanna give away too much of, like, what's going on with Josh because I thought all of that's very interesting. We made it known that there are 2 twists, and, like, I feel like at this point we're talking about 2 different chapters of the same game, so there are some things that, like, I'm like, "Oh, this was really cool. You should play the game and experience this." But also, like, we're gonna have to talk about the second half of the game.
Yeah, no, for sure. And again, they pull some things off in some really, really clever ways, and it's gonna be hard to like not get into 100% what they all are. But the main point that I'm really trying to make here is just that like Josh is a very fleshed out character, and I credit Rami Malek's performance, but also I feel like he gets more to work with than anybody else in this cast. Like, what do we really know about I don't I'm looking at all the names here. I'm just gonna pull one, like Matt. What do we know about Matt?
Uh, n that he's very angry at, I think, Mike.
Matt's like the one of the first characters you control early on in the game. I mean, you played him angry. It's so funny because I would actually, I picked Matt almost like specifically because he's the most non-character of all of these. For those of you who haven't played the game, like Matt is basically like supposed to be the jock character. He's got a Letterman jacket when he comes in, but like that's about the most anything that tells you anything about his character is that he's wearing a Leatherman jacket. Like the fact that he's the jock doesn't really come up other than the fact that he's got that jacket on.
Yeah, and honestly, I kinda forgot about it. I forgot that, like, he had the jacket, I forgot that he was supposed to be the jock.
Yeah, like Mike, who's played by Agents of Shield's Brett Dalton, or actor who did not break out after this game. Like he's the jerk character. He's the character that ends up being like the one who's like pokes fun at everybody. He's the like I guess the bully archetype. The twist with him is that he kind of ends up being like the secondary hero, which is unfortunate because he was the one that I wanted to see die the most at the beginning of the game. Like,
Yeah, big same.
but he at the same time has a little bit of character. And that's the thing I can say. Like most of these characters, they get a little bit of something. I picked up Matt as an example of how like all of them don't really get much personality beyond Josh because Matt gets the least of all. At least say one or two things about any of the other like cast members here. But in terms of like backstory, in terms of personality traits, like or anything that makes them distinct from one another, Matt definitely gets the worst of it. Chris is the funny geek, and probably the only reason I even say geek is because he has thick glasses, but he is the funny one. He has a budding relationship with Ashley that can go one way or the other because they're the two characters who get paired up for the most part. Actually, I think that is something that's kind of worth mentioning. Each of these characters actually does have a pairing. This is funny. I'm just realizing this now as we're recording this episode.
Oh, no, I definitely noticed that when we were playing.
But it feels like part of how they were able to pull off the magic trick, at least in this first game, is that you're really only ever focused on two characters at a time. That like helps them like limit those relationships because if all the characters have different relationships which are also tracked among all of these characters and they have different personality traits which depends on the choices that they're going to make and they show you a graph that has like all of them. One of the ways that they're actually able to limit how much story there is in this game and how much you as the player have to keep track of and notice yourself when playing it, they can keep it really small by just limiting the interactions between all the characters. It's actually very clever. It allows them to again get you that that feeling that there is infinite choices, even though there isn't. I'm sorry for the this is a moment of realization on my part. Seeing a little bit through that veil. That's really cool.
Oh, man, you start to see the magic trick.
Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting because Matt gets paired with Emily because and they're in a relationship at the start of the game. Emily does have some history with Mike, therefore again we can build upon drama. But Matt and Mike only ever interact at the beginning of the game, just so they can have that kind of chance at a conflict. After that, they kind of go to their separate corners and never interact again. Whereas Matt and Emily are basically paired the entire game unless one of them dies at a certain point. There are exceptions to these kind of canon pairings, but for the most part, throughout most of the runtime of the game, these two characters will just stick together, and it's usually that's where we build their personality. Probably the best example I have of this is Ashley and Chris. I could not tell you much about Ashley as a character beyond her relationship with Chris. I mean, same with Chris. Chris, I can just say is the funny one, and Ashley has a crush on Chris at the beginning of the game. I can tell you that I have done 2 playthroughs, one where Chris and Ashley get together at the end, and one where Ashley basically murders Chris.
Which goes back to the Telltale games where this character will remember this decision.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's and what's cool about it is that it's not just one decision that you make. It there are a variety of factors that go into whether or not Ashley decides to kill Chris or not. And when I say kill Chris, I should say that they are running from a thing, and whether or not Ashley holds the door or opens the door for him. So it's not like she stabs him or anything, but just to be clear. But it's a series of choices that lead her to make that choice. And again, she makes that choice of her own independence. Again, heavy quotations. But yeah, beyond just those kind of choices that those players are making independent of each other that kind of be born out of the choices that you make earlier on, there's just I don't know. This we've kind of said this over and over again at this point, but none of these characters really go beyond their movie tropes, which is unfortunate, I guess, but I don't know, it doesn't stop the game from being memorable.
Oh, certainly not. I think in some ways, the fact that they're not memorable, just it makes them clay. You can just kind of attach, "Oh, this person reminds me of somebody that I know," and it allows you to kind of attach feelings to these characters. I think that's part of it, is that, they don't have to be that deep. You add it just by, playing the game and making the decisions and, guiding them. You kind of put a little bit of you or the people that you know or whatever that is into these characters, and that's where the impact comes from.
Yeah, for sure. We alluded earlier that there are 2 big twists to this game. The other one being the red herring that it's a slasher film. The big thing is that this is a creature feature. The characters have actually been being stalked by monsters the entire time, that exist in these mountains. Very specifically Wendigos, which actually come from Native American folklore. I mean, I think Lamont, you when you noted that it was a Wendigo, you had mentioned,
Oh, skinwalkers. Yes, yes. At first, that was my first thought was skinwalkers, yeah.
I will say that, like, when I first played this game, Wendigos were just, an enemy to Final Fantasy for me. I know, I'm so uncultured. It was a Final Fantasy creature or something that I would see in different fantasy RPGs. I wasn't as familiar with the background of these creatures. Like, what was your familiarity with them?
So, I got it wrong. I just had to look up the difference between, like, a skinwalker and a wendigo, and, they're 2 very different things. I don't know how I got one from the other.
Yeah, it's funny though because skin is involved. I mean, these are creatures that are born out of cannibalism. The mechanics of the game, I feel, are probably very specific to the game, rather than actual like folklore. But the thing that I thought was interesting is that the game was partially written like half of the writers that we mentioned before, Larry Fessenden, who actually appears in the game as a character, had actually written a movie called Wendigo prior to prior to writing Until Dawn. So this is a creature folklore that Larry Fessenden apparently is very passionate about because he wanted a second shot at the material, I guess.
Adrian, I need to take a moment to say that only now, having looked up Wendigo and playing this game, did I realize that on the show Hannibal, that's the thing that he kept becoming, the Wendigo. That's the thing that we kept seeing with the antlers, and now it makes sense because of the whole cannibalism thing. I don't know how I only just caught this.
Well, you're not the only one. I've seen Hannibal, but I didn't catch on to that too. Again, I hadn't really done extensive research on the creature of Wendigo until this. Like, and I let me like save a little bit of face. Yes, I know that Final Fantasy takes character names from other folklore and mythology and religions and just kind of does their own thing with the names. Like I knew Wendigo came from something. I don't know that I specifically knew that it was a creature from Native American folklore. I don't know that I knew the specifics of it. I mean, obviously, I had played Until Dawn before where they kind of gloss over it, but it's not a big focus of the Until Dawn story. I think that this is probably a good time to mention that something that all Supermassive games do is that there is background lore that is happening that you can get more details through pickups and collectibles. One of the things that these games do for replay value is have a number of collectibles that fill in the backstory that you're probably going to miss 90% of them the first time that you play. They want you to keep playing the game. They want you to see all the different choices, and they want you to find all of these different things. And one of the backstories, there are multiple backstories, but one of the categories is specifically like the Wendigo folklore, how long they've been in the mountains, where they've come from, etc., etc. So, I played the game before. I didn't dig that deep into it. I was just like, okay, cool. Monsters, cannibalism, let's go. I definitely did a bigger deep dive for this recording, and that went as far as actually watching Larry Fesseden's Wendigo movie from 2001. And it was fine. It was one of those movies that made me feel like I might be too stupid for it. It's not a slasher
I
movie.
I don't even know what that means.
It's a psychological horror film, is what it means. It means that the story isn't 100% clear. Some things are left for interpretation. I am not sure that I 100% got it. I think there was a real Wendigo in the movie, but it operates under different rules than what it does in the film. It definitely was not what I was expecting when I found out that one of the writers of this game had made a movie that covered the same subject matter like years before. It was not the movie I was expecting it was going to be.
What a twist.
Yeah, I mean, what that tells me is just that this is subject matter that I think Larry Fessenden has a passion for. They do, at the very least, kind of make a passing reference in Until Dawn that the land which the game takes place is land that was stolen from Native Americans. Josh's family, who owns the cabin, their ancestors had a little bit to do with that, and I think that like those are just there are elements of that that are also in the Wendigo movie that I feel like is just something that Larry Fessenden thinks a lot about, and just wanted to make it a part of this, even though it's not a main focus of the games, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, one of the funny things too is that like I've never been a huge fan of teen slasher movies. I'm also not a big fan of creature features, and I still am not. There are some exceptions. There are some movies that I like, but for the most part, like I like horror that has like humans at the center of it. To me, horror creature features are more disaster films than anything else. And disaster films can be fun, but that's not really what I go to horror for. I go to horror for learning more about human beings and for human stories. And usually, like, they tend to go into like deep psyche stuff. And slashers are better for that. Certainly, Josh as a potential villain, like this game dives really really deep into Josh's mental state, and the Wendigo twist at first feels like it's kind of pulling away from that, and it becomes more about forces of nature than the characters themselves. And I will freely admit that the second part of the game to me is not as interesting as the first part. But that's me. I don't know how you feel, Lamont.
Um, so I'm gonna preface this with saying that I did not finish the game completely. But I will say that for me, it didn't pull away from that. Like, I thought it was a fun twist. I like the way they set it up because the whole time, even in the beginning, you were seeing these other characters and you're forced to question like, who are these people? What are they doing? So once the twist hit and we got Wendigos in, and then it's like, oh, that's who these that at least that's who this other guy is with a flamethrower. I thought it was cool, and I definitely like the way that they showed you the stranger. They showed you the stranger was there the whole time. You just didn't know who he was and what he was doing until we got to that twist. I also just for me, once again, I liked it. I thought it was fun. I thought it changed, of course, from slashers to creatures, but it didn't take away from that for me. Like, you were still exploring, you were still, you know, it just became a different kind of fear that, the stalking was still there. It's just now what was coming at you wasn't human, and it made it a little more, but outside of that, no, I it didn't take away from me at all. I really enjoyed it. I liked the transition from, A plot to B plot. Knowing the ending, now, like, a lot of the things that you were seeing in the A plot, like, made sense. They were showing you a lot of things in these pictures, and I thought it was very well done.
I will say that I think that Supermassive is really good at paying off everything that you've seen previously. They're very good at setting up twists, which is, I'm one of those people that I like a good twist, but also feel like they're a really hard thing to pull off correctly. And most things, especially horror, I'm mostly talking about movies, not necessarily video games, are very bad at twists. They're very bad at it. I think that Supermassive does a really, really good job of setting things up and then paying them off. I will say that even in my first playthrough, like I knew that the guy with the flamethrower, I knew that the stranger, I knew the twist was that this was going to be the good guy. I knew that they were going to be the sort of the mentor character who was going to come out of the shadows and teach everybody. I did not see the twist of Josh coming. I totally bought that they killed Josh and Josh was dead and that this was just some weird jigsaw ripoff guy who was mad about the mountain being stolen. I totally bought that story. And yeah, no, I agree. I also agree that in the second half of the game, with the Wendigos and everything. I totally like did not see that twist coming, and they pulled it off very masterfully there. The only thing that like I could have predicted was that the guy with the flamethrower was going to turn out to be a good guy, but that was it. And I would say the same thing of the other Supermassive games that we're not talking about here. We will do our own Dark Pictures anthology, and Lamont knows this. I am really excited to get to the Dark Pictures games. I actually like them a lot more than Until Dawn, and I really like Until Dawn. So really what transformed the game for them when it was going to be a PlayStation Move title originally. They decided to kind of go the other direction because of like when they played the game in third person camera. But it's interesting to me in that again, you don't really control the characters that much. Like I would almost argue that the moments where you are controlling a character is more of an interstitial part to the main gameplay, which is mostly watching things happen and making decisions while you watch things happen. Or also, of course, doing quick time events, which also can change the direction of the story. It's not just making choices, but it's also like passing or failing certain challenges in the game, whether or not that's a quick time event or the don't move, don't breathe sections.
Hated those.
Yeah, same. I mean, they get supplanted by better things in future titles.
Yeah, and
Got
Medan, I think it's the heartbeat thing or whatever that is so much better than like the keep your controller completely still.
Yeah, and they do that for all the Dark Pictures, the anthologies, and they do something different for the Quarry that I don't actually remember at the moment. That'll be when we do the the Quarry podcast. Yeah, those don't breathe segments really feel like just a holdover from the PlayStation Move days. Plus, again, this was a not a launch title for the PlayStation 4, but a showcase for the PlayStation 4. What's going to make the PS4 different from the previous PlayStation 3 generation? And so now I say this knowing that the PlayStation 3 was what introduced the 6-axis Sony's movable controllers, but still actually this is kind of interesting for me to think about. It's interesting that they kept that they have the don't breathe segments, which again is like kind of using unique elements of the PlayStation 4 controller, but they don't do anything with the touchpad interestingly enough.
You know what? That's a good point. The most that they did with the touchpad is I think they let you flip through a book with it once.
Yeah, like most of the items that you pick up in the game, even when they kind of have that like diegetic moment of just like holding a paper in front of you, you can just kind of like look at it. But they don't. There's not really that many instances of like flipping through pages, and you think there would be more. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to me still that was such a big moment for them and changed the direction of the game when ultimately again like the stuff that you do like in control of a character like what you would traditionally think of as a video game not really a big part of the actual moment to moment gameplay of Until Dawn. But yeah, I guess people liked the game. The thing is that I don't really remember Until Dawn making a big splash when it came out. I don't know any huge Until Dawn fans, but what's interesting to me is that number one, Supermassive actually had several projects in development at the same time as Until Dawn and even after Until Dawn. And all of them, as far as I can tell, all of them were canceled or just unreleased. And since Until Dawn, they've released the two aforementioned spin-off titles that we mentioned we didn't play, both VR titles, Rush of Blood and The Inpatient, but also the Dark Pictures anthologies, which are basically short form Until Dawn. Like there's very little different about those games. To where again, like Lamont, we had talked before the podcast. You had mentioned how they kind of consider the Quarry the follow up to Until Dawn, and I just think that's hilarious personally because there are some similarities, but for the most part, really the only thing that sets the Quarry apart from the Dark Pictures anthologies compared to Until Dawn is that it's longer. It's a longer game in the same way that Until Dawn is about like an 8 to 10 hour game.
I think when I was reading about the quarry and why they consider that one more of a sequel than like the Dark Pictures is thematic. Like they're like, well, we decided that we wanted to go back to the slasher theme, and so I think that's really the thing that ties the two together. I haven't played the quarry yet. I'm going to like after the research for this podcast and playing a little bit of the Dark Pictures anthology. I'm hooked. Like I'm going to be experiencing a lot more of what Supermassive has to offer.
Hmm. I have played the Quarry, and I there are some thematic connections, but I would call them tenuous at best. Comparing them to the Dark Pictures anthologies, which are basically the same gameplay, the same story gimmicks. There is a slight twist in a couple of them, and as we kind of established, Until Dawn isn't really a slasher, and neither is The Quarry. We'll talk more about that in the Quarry episode, although there is a kind of a dark cloud hanging over that game that also has some interesting connections still in Until Dawn. We'll get into those. Has a little bit to do with where they pull their folklore from. But again, more on that when we do eventually cover The Quarry. Yeah, but since the game was released, like I said, like I don't know what the fan response is. I mean, but clearly it was enough to allow Supermassive to keep making these games, to get interest from other publishers outside of Sony to keep making these games. And now Sony seems to be going all in on the Until Dawn IP, because they've got the PlayStation 5 remaster coming out soon, as well as a movie.
So the movie thing has me curious because I don't think it's impossible, but I don't know. It feels like it would be hard for a theatrical experience. My thought when I think of an Until Dawn movie would be what they did with Black Mirror. I can't remember what the interactive movie thing was, but, like, that would that would be my thought, like, if you were gonna do Until Dawn as a movie, it would have to be something like that.
It's funny. I didn't even consider Black Mirror. Bandersnatch, by the by, is the title you're thinking of.
Thank you.
I'm honestly surprised we didn't talk about that and have that come up because back when I ranted a bit ago about the expectation of the choose your own adventure or interactive movie, a format that let's be clear predates The Walking Dead, right? This choose your own adventure thing has been a thing for a long time. It was something that Hollywood was thinking about like in the early to mid 90s in the CD-ROM era. Yeah, I even remember there was a thing at Epcot that was essentially like a prototype version of this. This is back like 1997, I want to say. There was a thing at the Epcot Center where you would like sit down and you would watch a movie, and there were like these four buttons in front of you that allowed you to like choose which direction you wanted the story to go. And they had people vote on it, which is not dissimilar to that Silent Hill thing that happened recently.
I was just about to mention that when you mentioned the voting, I'm like, "Oh, it's Ascension."
Yeah, basically, but this was back in the 1990s, so, like, none of this is new, and the Black Mirror Bandersnatch episode got a lot of flack for kind of the same thing, like, that, like, Netflix was pitching this as, like, this, like, new kinda thing that wasn't really that new, and most people know the trick to it, and, to be honest, I say this as someone who's not a big Black Mirror fan. In fact, I probably dislike more Black Mirror than I like it. I liked Bandersnatch, and I thought it did pretty cool things with the format. But again, my expectations for these kind of choose your own adventure things are fairly low. But that being said, an Until Dawn movie doesn't really make much sense to me. I mean, I imagine that they're not going to do an interactive a film thing because number one, what would be the point? That already exists. It's the video game. But also, what's the point of like taking this and turning it into a linear traditional movie either? Like you and me kind of established this that the stuff that Supermassive did with the choose your own adventure format, like they're the first to have innovated it, I would say, since Telltale's take.
Oh, yeah, easily.
But, like, once you remove that element of it, that innovative take on it where, again, like, characters are making decisions independent of you that are still, like, the cause and effect of your choices, like, once you remove that, it's not an amazing story.
No, no, definitely not. I mean, the twist is good, but I don't wanna say that it's, like it's kinda generic. It's predictable to some degree. As I said, there's the twist, but, like, kind of going through a lot of it, it plays it by the numbers, and it definitely borrows heavy inspiration from other things, like, it wears it on its sleeve very loud.
Right, yeah, and that's totally intentional too. Like they went into this being like, okay, we're gonna play with these tropes and we're gonna try to twist them a little bit. And one of the ones that works again is Rami Malek's character, Josh. But what happens, when you take that in a 2-hour movie as opposed to a 10-hour game? Are they really going to have the time to like build that up correctly? We get a lot of time with this character. I mean, we didn't even talk about the framing device of the therapist and, how that plays into the twist and everything. Like all of those things help to build it up so that the twist isn't really about the twist. It's not really about the surprise. It's really about like building up Josh's character, why he is the way that he is and how that connects to the story and everything. Like they do a good job with all of those things, but it's also the kind of thing that I don't know, works better when you have 8 to 10 hours as opposed to 2.
Yeah, agreed, absolutely.
Yeah, I really don't know. I try not to be super cynical about these things. My general take on sequels and adaptations and remakes is it really just depends on the director and writer. You get the correct combination of director and writer, anything is viable. I don't like to just like take an idea completely off the table, but like this already has a completely established plot. There's not much to build off of there if you wanted to make an original story, like say the Fallout TV show. Yeah, I agree. I just don't see where you go from this and any kind of significant expansion. Then it's just not Until Dawn. It's just something else. And yeah, before we go, I think one last other thing to touch on is, recent news, as I mentioned, there is a remaster of this coming out for PS5. Again, some would argue that a remaster feels kind of pointless because Until Dawn is not an old game, but it is an old game. It's almost 10 years old at this point. It's going to get a PC release, which means that more people are able to experience it if you are not a person who buys consoles, and a lot of people are not buying consoles anymore. Maybe you missed it. Great way to re experience it. Gotta say, personally, I was not a fan of the new look of the game.
Yeah, I still have not actually checked that out, but, I mean, I'm gonna take your word for it. What don't you like about the look? Did they change character designs or, like, art
No,
style?
no, not significantly. I mean, like, in it, this, one thing that would be very difficult to change with this is that, these are actors playing themselves. They didn't really like give anybody a unique look or anything. Again, one of the selling points was how good the facial capture was, which I don't actually think you and me talked enough about, which is that, when you consider that Until Dawn is coming off like 3 years off of LA Noire, which was the first game to really push facial capture, which kind of looked weird even back then and definitely doesn't look great now. Until Dawn, like 2015 Until Dawn's facial capture is phenomenal.
Oh, yeah, it's honestly incredible.
They're super proud of it too. Like, and this is still something you see in their current games is that like, you know, you're in control of a character, you just like set the controller down for like 10 seconds, it just zooms down on our face. You select pause. The only thing you see on the pause menu outside of like all the details that are on the screen is just every single menu screen. It's the actor's face and them just kind of looking around and chewing on their lips or gumming their thumbs. Like I don't know if you also noticed this, but like in every supermassive game, like everyone just moves their lips constantly, whether they're talking or not.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and they're definitely, like, hiring actors who are very good at facial expressions, like, that's clearly something that, they look for when they're hiring cast members for their games.
Actually, I do wanna mention something about that because we were talking about the, cast earlier. So, I'm not sure if you caught this particular thing, but Brett Dalton, he's actually the only one of the actors who was a part of the game originally. So, like, at some point, they decided to redo the story or something like that, and in doing that, they completely recast the entire game except for him. He's the only one who made the cut.
I actually did not know that, and that is fascinating to me, and I would love to know what the, original was. Like, even Hayden, Pantiere?
Yeah, like, Rami, Hayden, they were not a part of the original, like, cast.
I would love to yeah, I'd definitely love to know who the original cast was then because, I mean, like, again, like, Hayden Pantiere is kind of like the highlight of Until Dawn. You know, Brett Dalton was kind of a new and up and comer who, kinda burnt out very quickly, and Rami Malek was I'm not gonna say he was unknown, I think he was in a James Bond movie by this point, but, he hadn't Mr. Robot hadn't happened yet, so
Yeah, I thought that was I found that to be fascinating. I thought you would as well.
going back to what we were saying about the remaster, though, so the biggest thing, and I can already like, I'm looking on Google image search right now and seeing some people who are also not happy about this, is they got rid of the blue color grading, like the blue filter
Oh.
on a lot of scenes, like the thing that, like, makes Until Dawn look like Until Dawn.
Oh, that's a weird choice.
It's a very strange choice, and even, like, stranger is that, like, by doing that, a lot of scenes have this kind of gold look to them.
Oh, no, I'm looking at it. That's really strange.
Yeah, like, this isn't a film podcast, like, I could probably talk a lot about how the art of color grading has gone away, in a lot of films recently too, and it feels like the same thing the same thing to Ultimate Dawn, which actually had a very unique look that is just not there anymore.
Yeah, yeah, I'm looking at some of these side by sides, and you're right. Oh, it's very strange.
Yeah, and again, I think that, apart from just getting rid of the color grading, although, honestly, I think that does, like, 90% of the job, like, it just looks a lot less like a horror movie. There's also because it has, dynamic lighting now, like, certain scenes and well, to be clear, the old game actually had a lot of dynamic lighting too, but this one really leaning heavily into, like, HDR dynamic lighting. Some scenes are just much darker than they used to be, which means that, like, characters' facial expressions and stuff get obscured. Again, that thing that this game was, uh, the tech that this game was really pushing back then.
Yeah, no, I'm not feeling that. But I will say that, with it coming out on PC, I'm sure that, that someone's gonna get a blue shader put in.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely fans, I think, are gonna have fun, like, hacking this. And, that's always one of the benefits of putting things on PCs, is we just let the fans do interesting things. Maybe that's something we'll talk more about when we eventually get to our Silent Hill 2 podcast, but that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, so that being said, I don't think it's so much of a change that it's just going to ruin the game. I mean, it is basically the same game coming out that just looks slightly worse. It's not like it's a full change. So I'm not saying don't get the remaster if you've never experienced it. I'm not saying that you need a PlayStation 4 to see the real Until Dawn. I'm just saying, you and me played this game like from this recording, like maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Like it's not like my memory is this idea of what it used to look like. It's like, no, I played this game fairly recently. I do not think this remaster looks as good as the original.
Yeah, no, I having just played it, like, as you said, 3 weeks ago and seeing these screenshots, I'm not really that impressed. It looks good. It looks good as far as, like, I saw, Josh's mask, and I like that you can see, all the detail, but there's something about the filters, the blue that really does something. But as I said, I am pretty sure that that game's gonna come out. Someone's gonna use G shade or something like that, and it's gonna look just like it did, color grading wise on the on console. I at that point I just feel bad for anyone playing it on the PS5 that won't have that option.
Death, oh death, death, oh death, death, oh death, bear me over another year.
Yeah, any real closing thoughts on Until Dawn? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention?
You know what? It's brief, but I did like the music in the game as well. Like, when there was music, I really did enjoy it.
And I also will comment that the opening theme, which I believe is an original take on a public domain song. I could be wrong about that. I've listened to a lot of different versions of "Oh Death" up since then, but like that really put me in the mood for this game. I mean, I think there's a lot just about the overall setting and vibe of this game that really worked for me. I said earlier that I was a little disappointed when it became a creature feature, and part of that is because number one, the framing device of the psychologist, where you don't know that you are playing Josh during those moments. They're trying to be like it's you in first person, but those like cutaways to the psychologist, the framing of the totems that you get, which show you the future and the past, and that whole intro with the Odeth song really put me into this like kind of place that, oh, okay, so it is a slasher movie, but maybe there's something more happening here. And when I say more, I was thinking more like ghostly, something more that you would have to like think about. Put me into this like really, really good place and vibes that, I don't typically associate with a creature feature. That's a me thing, I'm sure, but all it is to say is that like I didn't feel like I was watching a trashy gore-filled slasher when playing this game. This game was not Until Dawn was not The Burning, and it puts you in that mindset very, very early on with just things like, yeah, like the music, the setting, the tone, it's all just kinda elevates it a little bit higher than, what the source material might lead you to believe that it is.
Very nice. And I think one other thing that I wanna mention that I did appreciate about this game, there are times where it reminds you that the decision to not make a decision is okay, and I really did enjoy that.
Yeah, I think it's funny because, again, like, they're really especially in this kind of, like, freshman take on what's going to be Supermassive's like, main style of game. It's one of the things that I think really does make it feel unique from The Walking Dead, is that The Walking Dead also has its moments of, you have a timer, you can also choose not to say anything, but they don't put emphasis on it. Although both The Walking Dead and this game have the quick time events and have the action sequences that also play into the direction the story goes, I could be wrong on this, so I'm sure someone will correct me if I am. I don't remember any moment in The Walking Dead where saying or doing nothing was the correct quote unquote choice or was like didn't just make everyone angry at you. That game it always felt like doing nothing was probably the worst thing that you could do. And that's an artistic choice for sure. I liked in this one where sometimes doing nothing was also like maybe the best choice, quote unquote.
Agreed. How about you, Adrian? Do you have anything else?
I mean, the biggest thing that I would just say is that like this is not my favorite Supermassive game, but I do think that if you are curious about these, I mean, honestly, you could jump into any one of them, right? Maybe not the VR spin-offs because those are direct sequels slash prequels to Until Dawn. You could really jump into any of them, and I highly recommend that you do. I think Until Dawn is a fine place to start. I'm actually kind of happy, Lamont, that you started with it, just because, and now you're playing Man of Medan, so you're actually going to kind of get the experience that everyone else did. And I do think that the opinions people have on this series, and I'm including Until Dawn and The Quarry as the same series as the Dark Picture anthologies. I think the people, like, I do think that the order you play them in does set a level of expectation. And so, starting with Until Dawn, I think is a fine place, and it might like affect some of your feelings and decisions towards the other one. That being said, if you want to play a game that is like this, but you don't have the 10 hours to dedicate to it, then maybe start with one of the Dark Picture anthologies and play a game that's only like 3 to 4 hours. Maybe play the remaster when that comes out. Like, again, we spent a good amount of time funking on it here, but there's nothing about that remaster that tells me that you're not going to get a similar experience than if you had played this one. So, if you're curious, I highly recommend them. I guess, like, I'll just repeat one last time. As far as the interactive story games with tons of choices go, I think these are by far the most innovative and the most interesting, at least as a game. Probably The Walking Dead is the best written one, but these ones are very interesting, and I always get excited every time a new one's coming out.
Yeah, and I think we might not have mentioned it, but I mean, we're gonna be seeing more. Supermassive, they finished their first season for Dark Pictures, and we're getting a second season.
I'm glad that you brought that up because it is something I did wanna say too, is that so since the Dark Picture anthology, The Devil in Me, the last game in season 1 came out, and the announcement for season 2 starting with Directive 8020, which I'm really excited about, like, 'cause I'm really excited for a sci-fi horror game. I like that genre just in general. But in between those two titles, Supermassive did, like so many other game developers recently, announce a lot of layoffs. They laid off about 90 people in their staff. I do worry, and I think this is a completely legitimate fear to have right now, that I wonder if we're even really going to finish out a season 2 before they go the way of so many other, like, mid-tier studios.
I hope we get a season 2, but, I mean, as you said, with layoffs like that, it's less less probable.
Um, we'll see, I guess. I don't have, like, we're in a really strange place in the game industry, and Supermassive is the exactly, like, that level of, like, not like a Last of Us Part 2 Naughty Dog level of scope, but still, like, high enough for a niche style of game that, like, it's the kind of studio that I would not put money on, let's, like, in this current atmosphere, in this current economy, let's say. All right, I think that's gonna wrap it for Until Dawn. Shall we tell them what we are doing next month, Lamont?
I'm gonna be honest, Adrian, I feel like I am playing a guessing game here, but are we exploring a little bit of a Alan Wake?
A little bit, just a taste of Alan Wake, and specifically, we're gonna be covering the first Alan Wake, which I'm really excited about. I don't like hide that this is one of my favorite games of all time. As of this recording, I've got Alan Wake 2 reinstalling on my PlayStation 5 because the Night Springs DLC is coming out, so this is a great time to kind of jump into talking about that first game. One of my favorite developers, Remedy Entertainment. So much to cover here, and also an excuse to make you finally play the first Alan Wake.
I know, which is wild because, like, I've owned that game for a long time. It's just hanging out in my Steam library. For years, I have had the first, like, Alan Wake with the DLC, with the American Nightmare DLC, and I've started it, and I feel like I got to, like, maybe that little, like, logging area, and then I just somehow stopped, and I don't know why.
I could probably interrogate that one a little bit, but we should probably save it for the next episode. Regardless, though, thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast and this is your first time with us, welcome. Go check out our other episodes on Alone in the Dark and Clock Tower 1, 2, and Ghost Head / The Struggle Within. Those episodes are really, really good. You should go check those out. You could also join our Patreon for as low as $1 a month. You can listen to a couple other bonus podcasts and bonus material that we covered, including my review of the new Alone in the Dark 2024 that is available exclusive to Patreon members, as well as getting to join our Discord channel, getting to vote on upcoming episodes and things that you would like to see. Please check that out. That's just patreon.com/playingdread. And if you're looking for other horror content, maybe check out our friends over at the New Jersey Horror Collective with their podcast, Horror Wars, where they take 2 horror movies and pit them side by side. Really, really fun podcast. You should check that out as well. But that's going to be it for us this month. We will see you next time. Again, that's going to be Alan Wake for the month of July. We will see you all then.
Thank you very much. And once again, this has been Playing Dread.
You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 media production and member of the New Jersey Horror Collective. Check out our show notes, Patreon, and other social media at www.playingdread.com. Intro music, The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, was used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Other music by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Torres, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind, also used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The song Oh Death by the Pace Jubilee Choir, used through the public domain.